Hi, fourth grade. We are reading another story about Yosemite Valley. This book is called Squirrel and John Muir by Emily Arnold McCulley. And of course, it's also based on a true story. Hutchings' house was plain as a barn and sat in an isolated valley that lay like carpet at the foot of the mountains. It was operated by James Hutching, his wife Elvira, and her mother Mrs. Sproat. The Hutchings children were Floy, her little sister Cozy, and her baby brother William. Floy was the first white child born in Yosemite Valley. She tore around it like a squirrel, so that was what they called her. Papa said Yosemite Valley was the most beautiful place on earth. Floy had never been anywhere else. Floy filled the hours by talking to the family's pet parrot, balancing on a plank by the woodpile, making mud pies, and capturing frogs. Papa wrote magazine articles that made people want to come and see the spectacular scenery for themselves. They made the difficult journey on horseback to stay in the hotel and go on Papa's guided tours. Floy would barge up to the tourists and say, "Why did you come? Do snakes scare you? They don't scare me. If you get bit, I'll save you. What about bears?" Then she'd growl at them. "What an odd little child," they would mutter. Papa let Floy go on his tours, but once when the group was too poky to suit her, she let them to follow a deer track and wasn't found until after dark. "I can't mind you and a business at the same time," Papa said. "You'll have to stay home from now on." Another time, the boys at the stable dared her to ride on an unbroken horse. "Where have you been, you wild thing?" Granny Sproat cried when she came in. "Clean yourself off before the guests see you." At night, Papa read Shakespeare aloud to the guests. Afterward, Floy watched them undress. A lady heard her snickering and complained, "Mr. Hutchings, that girl of yours is a little savage." Papa decided that customers needed more privacy, such as would be provided by walls between their rooms. He bought a water-powered sawmill, but he couldn't run it and make the hotel improvements by himself. One day, a man sauntered up to the hotel as if the fates had sent him. "I'm John Muir," he said. "I'm looking for work." "He's just the man," Papa cried after they had talked. "He's a sawyer, a carpenter, and an inventor." Floy dangled a lizard in front of the man. Tourist ladies usually squealed. "Hello, little go-quick," Muir said to the lizard. To Floy, he said, "I think he wants to be free, just as we do." Floy stared at him. She put the lizard on the ground. "Don't pester the man," Papa said. Papa and John Muir set up the sawmill and cut boards. John Muir built himself a small cabin, slinging his bed from the ceiling and letting a stream run right along his dirt floor. John Muir worked hard, but he took time to wander through the valley. One day, Floy followed him along the river. He waded into the current and stretched out on a rock. After a few minutes, Floy couldn't keep quiet. "What are you doing?" she called. "I'm finding how it feels to be a river rock," he said. "Rocks don't feel," she said. Maybe they do. We don't know how to ask them," he said. Floy asked, "Are you crazy?" John Muir laughed. Granny Sproat knew how to predict the weather. When she said it was going to snow, John Muir went dashing outside as if the house had caught fire. "Where are you going?" Floy called. "To listen for the sound of snowflakes landing," he said. "I don't hear anything," Floy said. "You're not quiet yet," Muir replied, bounding off. When spring came and flowers bloomed in the meadows, Floy heard John Muir teasing them. "Now, how did you come here, sweet blue-eyed darling?" he asked one. "Didn't I see you miles away last year?" He filled his pockets, his shirt front, and his handkerchief with blossoms, leaves, twigs, and pebbles. On a sultry afternoon, a thunderstorm blew up and made little Cozy cry. "Don't be frightened," John Muir said soothingly. "Storms are nature's glory." He pulled on his jacket. "Are you going out?" Floy asked. I want to hear the trees singing in the wind, he said. Floy watched him from the house as he shinnied up a tall tree and swayed back and forth like a bobolink on a reed. That man acts like an overgrown schoolboy, Papa said. When he had the day off, John Muir went climbing. Floy watched him skip up sheer rock faces until he was out of sight. Hours later, he came flying back down, arms and legs churning. What do you do up there? She asked him. I look, he said. Well, that's not anything, said Floy. John Muir fell to his knees. Look here, he said. It's just some old ants, Floy answered. Now look again, he said, handing her his little magnifying glass. Floy gasped. A huge ant was crushing a leaf in its jaws. Here's another trail to follow, Muir said. I don't see it, said Floy. Grasshopper, Muir said. Now where is he? There, cried Floy, seeing it hop. Floy was captivated. She used the magnifying glass to examine a bug clinging to the underside of a leaf and a dewdrop that seemed to hold the whole world. John Muir told her the names of animals, birds, and plants and how he listened for what they had to say. You've learned to see what's small and near, he said. Now we're ready to take in the mountains. Floy raised her eyes. They're staring at us, she said. They're talking to us, Muir said. Muir believed that the mountains and valleys had been formed by glaciers millions of years earlier. When he climbed them, he rose from ledge to ledge as if lifted by the clouds he called sky messengers. I'm looking for signs of that glacier ice, he said. They will prove that I'm right. One day, John Muir took Floy on a walk that followed some bear tracks. He told her he had found a lookout on the north wall. I call it Sunnyside Beach, he said. I sat looking long enough and eventually I saw. There are glacier trails, rocks and domes, all polished by ice from one end of the valley to the other. They show us how Yosemite Valley was formed. Will you take me to Sunnyside Bench? Floy asked. Someday, Muir said, when you are ready. John Muir spent his evenings with the family working on an article explaining his glacier theory. Then he mailed it to a New York newspaper. Maybe they'll publish it, he said. Papa complained. I don't pay him to hatch crazy ideas. Scientists say there never were any glaciers here. They're calling Muir ignorant. But pretty soon, some scientists were saying Muir was right about how Yosemite Valley was formed by glaciers. A batch of tourists showed up, waving newspaper clippings and asking for the famous guide, John Muir. The ladies in the group simpered and gushed. Muir was so handsome, so poetic, his theories so fascinating. Floy thought they were silly. She expected John Muir to say he was too busy to guide them. Well, they are silly, he said, but he just couldn't help talking about Yosemite Valley. He loved it so much. So Floy went with them. He explained about the glaciers and asked Floy to name the plants and animals. When we try to pick out anything in nature, he told the visitors, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Two ladies contrived to faint. Others whined about bee stings, torn clothes, and sore bottoms. But when they got home, they spread the word about the gentle genius of the Sierras. The more people came and asked for John Muir to be their guide instead of James Hutchings, the more Papa stewed. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. Muir, you're my hired man, he yelled. Either that's your purpose here or you leave. Muir nodded. Then I'll be on my way. Floy took off after him. I won't let you go, she cried. There's work I must do in the world, he said. Floy saw that he meant it. She screamed, I hate you, and ran off. Muir chased after her. Come, Squirrel, follow me. He held out his hand. I'll show you Sunnyside Bench. It will be yours now. Floy wiped her eyes. Everything changes, Floy. That's nature's first law. On the way up, he sang Highland Mary and called out, Squirrel, are you there? Every little while. She'd call back, yes, and heard her answer trail away. The valley lay below. It was the world as far as Floy was concerned. Beyond, in the midst, was all the rest where John Muir had come from and was going back to. Now you know the way, John Muir said. This is where you'll have your best thoughts, I expect. They sat for a long time. The sun sank to the horizon, and they scampered down over the rocks, as sure-footed as a pair of mountain goats. The author shares, oh look it, here's our little Floy, and here's John Muir. This story isn't exactly true, but it was meant to convey the spirit of what might have happened between John Muir and Floy Hutchings when they met in Yosemite in 1868. Muir did have a spot called Sunnyside Bench. He was 30 and on a quest to discover laws of nature that he himself could live by, free from society's expectations and constraints. Floyd's father, James Hutchings, did provide a job that sustained Muir while he used every free hour to comb the valley walls. Muir and the hotel keeper were at ironic cross purposes. Muir just wanted to be left alone to explore nature and his own soul. Before long, he was famous, and the wider world had claimed him after he wrote several books. Muir spent his long life climbing mountains and urging wilderness preservation on the American government. Remember how we read the story about how he went with Theodore Roosevelt to make Yosemite a national park? He was the first to oppose the westward expansionist movements. He also founded the Sierra Club. Yosemite was Muir's greatest stage, and it was Floy's home. She had spent one winter in San Francisco. At only 6, Floy was already a fierce, outspoken tomboy determined never to grow up if it meant being a lady. Muir called her that tameless one and a little black-eyed witch of a girl. But he took pity on her, gently instructing her in the ways of nature as he saw them. His sweetness and high spirits broke through her glowering loneliness. Floy carried her defiant ways into adolescence, flaunting flamboyance, fearlessness, and profanity. Almost as if she were the heroine of a tragedy, she was spared ever having to move outside the park or even growing up. She died at 17 on a climb, struck down by a falling boulder. And that's the end of our story. Next week, we'll do another one on the Sierras. We'll see you next week.